Hi guys, welcome to another installment of Beauty History. I am your host, Allison Chase, but my friends call me Allie. So for today's video, we are talking about the life and complicated legacy of Gabrielle Chanel. This has been my most highly requested video, so before we go any further, let's take a second to grab our iced coffee or a hot coffee. Let's take a sip and let's get started. All the information relating to the makeup and makeup brushes used in today's video will be in the description box down below. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and use my Chanel Les 4 Ombres number 342 Lumière et Opulence palette from the holiday collection this year. So Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel was born on August 19th, 1883. She was born to an unwed mother named Eugénie Jeanne de Vol, but she usually went by the name Jeanne preferably. And she grew up in Saumur, Western France. Now, Jeanne was a laundry woman in a charity hospital run by nuns. Gabrielle's father, Albert, was a peddler. He would travel from village to village selling rags and clothing. As I mentioned, Gabrielle's parents were not married when she was born, and it actually took her mother's family to convince Albert that he should marry her, because at this time, being born out of wedlock was something incredibly shameful. We're talking about 1883. This was not something that happened. You know, having children before you were married was very frowned upon. It was really not ideal. So eventually Albert and Jeanne did get married. That didn't change anything, actually. As I mentioned, Albert would travel from town to town to sell his rags and whatnot, but he was really never home. He only stopped by home long enough in order to get Jeanne pregnant again. He was never really a present parent. And so Jeanne and Albert would actually go on to have 6 children, and 5 of whom survived, and all of them would live in this tiny, cramped, one-room housing. Something to note is at Gabrielle's birth, her last name had a typo in it. It was spelled Chanel with an S in the middle. And at the time of the document being written, her mother Jeanne was too ill after giving birth to really be coherent, and her father was listed as traveling because he was never home. So she actually had this typo, this misspelling in her name in her official documents for her entire life, because had she tried to have the name corrected and changed, then people would have known that she was born in a poorhouse. It's also important to note that none of the kids attended school at this point. So when Gabrielle was 11 years old, her mother was 32, and her mother had given birth to 6 kids. And at 32, her mother passed away. Albert took the boys and sent them off to a farm to work as like farmhands, and he sent the girls off to a convent, and that was it. So Gabrielle was sent off to the convent of Aubazine, which was run by nuns. So this life here was very strict, very disciplined, also very frugal. It was at this place that she learned how to sew, and we can only assume she had some education there, enough to make her literate, because she didn't have any education before this. She stayed at the convent until she was 18, and then she had to leave because it was only a convent for orphaned or abandoned girls. So once you turned legal age, you had to get out. So she went to the town of Moulins, which is still like in the center western part of France, and she lived in a boarding house. Now, later in life, when she would talk about her childhood, she would talk about it in a very different light. She would basically pretend that she had a very glamorous and easy upbringing, and that she grew up fairly wealthy, and that she basically lied. She lied about being an orphan, she lied about being poor, she lied about being born out of wedlock. She said that her father left the family to go pursue his riches off in America. And she also said that after her mother passed away, that she was raised by her aunts, and she just basically reinvented her childhood. So I'm certain that a few of you have watched the movie Coco Avant Chanel or Coco Before Chanel, and it's a really good movie, but there were some inaccuracies with some of the characters. So if you've watched the movie and you're watching this episode right here, some facts might not be perfectly aligned, and you'll learn it later on. I'm just taking this lighter color on the inner corner right here. So she lived in a town called Moulins, and during the day she would work as a seamstress because she had learned this trade at the convent. But in the evenings, she would work at a singing cafe. This is different than a cabaret. A singing cafe during La Belle Époque had less of a seedy connotation than a cabaret. And her job was poseuse, which was the girl who would entertain the crowds in between the acts. So she was not the headliner, she was not the main event, but she would come out in between the main shows and sing and entertain the guests, and then she would pass around a hat or something to collect money, and that was basically the only way she got paid. Going into this darker color here and putting it on the outside corner. So she did try to have a career as a singer or entertainer for a little bit. She worked some time at Moulins, and then one summer she decided to go down south to Vichy. She went to the resort spa in Vichy, and she went there for one summer. But once she got there, her job was to pass around the mineral water from Vichy. And so she realized that being a singer was probably not in her cards. And it's around this time that she started adopting the nickname Coco. There are a few myths about the origins of her name. One of them being that one of the songs that she would sing was called Qui a vu Coco? And so that could be why she got the name Coco. It could also be for the French word cocotte, which is an allusion to a kept woman. So we don't really know for sure. Anyway, when she was working at the singing cafe in Moulins, she met someone named Etienne Balsan. Now, in the Coco Before Chanel movie, they say that Etienne is a baron. He wasn't. He was an exceptionally wealthy man. He had so much money. He came from old money, and he was an heir, so he just inherited everything. He didn't have an official title, but he was part of the upper class. His family had been part of the elites for a very long time, so he just had a lot of money. Anyway, he liked Coco, and so he decided to make her his mistress officially. What a title. And she would actually move in with him into one of his chateaus and live with him for 3 years. Now, I know some people have said negative things about Coco because of her choice or choices to be a kept woman. But honestly, if you were a woman born out of wedlock in 1883 with very little education, how many options would you have in life? Just think about that. Like, what were her options? You know, she couldn't just become a career woman back then, you know? So I feel like this is something that we can't judge her for. So Coco and Etienne's relationship lasted from 1906, 1909, that sort of time frame. And just think of what life was like in 1906 or 1909. A lot of people didn't even have running water in their homes. So this is just my opinion here. But knowing what we know about Coco's early life and upbringing, can you imagine what it was like for her to step into this world of immense wealth? Because she had to be invited into this world. She couldn't just like barge her way through. She had to have someone kind of lend her a hand to bring her into the other half of the world. And I can only imagine that once she arrived at Etienne's mansion, she probably thought, there is no way that I'm going back to my old life. That is just my opinion. So Etienne was actually part of the French cavalry, but as I mentioned, he was incredibly wealthy, and he just gave up his career in the military to pursue playing polo, breed horses, go to horse races. Like, he was so wealthy that he could just retire at an early age and live a life of leisure. And when Coco lived with Etienne, she also indulged in a life of leisure and just really enjoyed herself. But she also got a bit bored just being at home, being idle, and just not doing much of anything. So she started designing hats. That's how she started her way into the fashion world. She started designing hats just as a hobby, I guess, something to do. And it slowly became popular. But at the same time that she was Balsant's mistress, she met one of his friends named Arthur Boy Capel. And he was British, he was English. He was, I guess, what you would call new money. He was self-made. He was a shipping tycoon, but he also had a lot of money. But his money was new. It wasn't as closely associated with like the elites. He still had a lot of money, but it was different than Etienne. So it is said that Arthur Boy Capel was Coco's love of her life, essentially. This was the man that really stole her heart. She had many loves in her life, but I think this was the greatest love. Something that's unfortunate is, as I mentioned, Boy was part of new money and he had a huge business. But we have to think of the context of the times around 1909. People who had money or status or wealth of any kind were not free to marry whomever they chose. At this point in time, Coco had no money to her name. She had no title. She had no name. She was someone's mistress. And so I guess theoretically, Boy could have married her, but probably not realistically. Even though they had this grand affair that lasted a decade and they were in love and he supported her, he still ended up marrying someone else 9 years after they had been dating. They were together for 9 years before he married someone else. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being with someone for 9 years and then they decide to marry someone else because it's better for the business, it's better for the families? You know, back then, families like that would basically treat marriage as a business contract, you know? You get new money to marry an old title that doesn't have that much money, and then you just mix it together and everything's great. That's kind of the situation here. So anyway, so even though there's that little ick in their relationship, they did have a really great love affair and he did support her financially a whole lot. Arthur installed Coco in one of his apartments in Paris, and that's where she opened up her first shop and kept working on her hats. And she actually became a licensed milliner, which is someone who makes hats, in 1910. So this is when she officially registered and officially became a hat maker in Paris. And it was around this time that her hat making business actually had a really big boom, because there was an actress at the time named Gabrielle Coco who wore one of Gabrielle's hats. And everyone thought she looked amazing and lovely, and then she went on to wear one of these hats in a publication as well, which just helped the boom and interest in Coco's fashions. So during Boy and Coco's 10-year relationship, they would spend an awful lot of time in Deauville, Normandy. This is a seaside town. It still exists. It's still a very chic place. But during La Belle Époque, this was the place to see and be seen for the elites, the upper class, the super wealthy. This is where you went. This was the place to be. And so Arthur and Coco would spend a lot of time here. This is where high society went to watch polo matches, to go to the horse races, to watch les ballets russes. This is the place to be. So they spent a lot of time here. And what Coco did when she was in Deauville is she spent a lot of time just observing people, especially women. She would look at women's fashion, because this is still during La Belle Époque. So she saw women wearing these heavy corsets, lots of fabric, looking very encumbered and limited, especially because this was the context of the beach and sports and playing around, and these women were wearing these almost like straitjackets, just being so restricted and constrained. and she just didn't like it. She thought, why are we wearing these ridiculous things when we could be more comfortable in something else? And she was also inspired by the sea, by the beaches, by the color beige of the sand. She was inspired by the sailor outfits with the striped marinière sweaters, with the sailor pants. It was all inspiration to her. So in 1913, financed by Arthur, Coco opens her first boutique in Deauville, and she starts leisure luxury wear. And at the time, this was groundbreaking because, again, this is la belle époque. There's no leisure luxury wear. I'm going into my Chanel Ultra Teint foundation in B30. She also decided to utilize a different fabric. She decided to use jersey as a fabric because at this time it was only used for men's clothing, but she thought that it was so soft and comfortable and didn't understand why women's clothing couldn't be comfortable as well. So she created these soft luxury leisure collections. And she would have her sister Antoinette and her aunt Adrienne wear these collections, walk around the boardwalk, and then when people would ask them what these beautiful garments were, they would just sashay back to the shop and lead them to Coco's business. And Coco opened her boutique in the center of town, in the center of the boardwalk, so that like all of the traffic would go to her. So for the concealer, I'm going into my NARS Creamy Radiant in Medium 1 Custard. So a few years later, after having success in Deauville, Coco decided to open up a second boutique in Biarritz. This was in 1915. So Biarritz is in the south of France, but it's on the border with Spain. So it's on the Côte Basque. This was a slightly new clientele because Deauville had very wealthy French people, but Biarritz had very wealthy Spanish people. So she was just diversifying her clients and just spreading the word around. Biarritz was another beautiful seaside resort. And she also opened up her boutique in Biarritz directly in front of a casino. So, you know, going where the money was. And this second boutique proved to be extremely successful. After 1 year, she was able to pay back Arthur in full because he had financed everything. And with 1 year of Biarritz, she was able to give him back the money that he had lent her. It was also in Biarritz that Coco met the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia. The two would go on to have a romantic fling and would remain close years afterwards. So by 1919, Coco had registered as a couturière and she opened up her fashion house. And she did this at 31 Rue Cambon, which is still the location of the flagship Chanel store in Paris. I have been there. It is lovely to visit. And by 1927, she would actually go on to own the buildings 23 through 31 at Rue Cambon. So this is where she established her iconic boutique, and now we are entering into the roaring 20s. And on a sad note, we do have to mention that in 1919, Arthur tragically passed away in a car accident. It was very unexpected. It came out of the blue. And this was after about a decade of him and Coco having this romantic affair. This is said to be one of the saddest moments in her life. It was devastating because this was the love of her life. He had helped catapult her career. He had helped finance her, and he was taken away very tragically and unexpectedly. But nevertheless, she continued with her career. And in 1920, she met the Russian composer Igor Stravinsky, and he was actually helping to finance Les Ballets Russes. And I didn't realize this, but between 1923 and 1937, Coco Chanel actually helped dress Les Ballets Russes. Now for a bit of bronzer, I'm going into my Chanel Les Beige Healthy Glow Cream Bronzer. So by this point, she's already done her hats, but now she is established as a luxury fashion house. And she decides that she wants to do something to set her apart because, as I mentioned, this is the roaring 20s. And she is dressing the modern woman. She's dressing the flapper. She's dressing the woman who is throwing away her corset. And for her, an outfit and fashion is not complete until you add perfume. So she meets a man named Ernest Brault, who was a nose. Now, a nose is someone who creates fragrances. Now, at the time, women's perfume, as well as women's everything, was very constrained. Women at the time wore perfume of a single note. So they would wear a vanilla, a jasmine, a rose. They would not wear perfume like we wear today that has a ton of different notes. There's jasmine, there's lily, there's vanilla, there's musk. This at the time did not exist. So Coco commissioned Ernest Brault to create for her a modern perfume for the modern, elegant, sophisticated woman. And she also wanted to add aldehydes. This was not a fragrance note that was popular at the time. Aldehydes are very fresh, airy, and also a little bit soapy. And so she commissioned him to create this fragrance for her. I'm going into a bit of blush. This is the Chanel Jour Contraste number 72 Rose Initiale. So legend has it that Ernest presented Coco with many different little vials for her to test out. And as the myth goes, her favorite one was the 5th selection, and that's how we have Chanel number 5. So this perfume, Chanel number 5, was revolutionary, not only for mixing all of the notes together, but also for adding aldehydes. This was not something that had been seen before. So Chanel number 5 took the world by storm, and it was really symbolic of the modern flapper, the woman who was liberated and modern and was just a new woman in a new generation. It's also said that the number 5 was always a number that Coco associated with good luck. You know, some people have a number or a symbol that for them represents good luck. Well, for Coco, it was number 5. And so I think that also makes sense as to why the perfume is called Chanel number 5. So for the highlighter, I'm going into my Éclat Énigmatique Metal Peach. I'm just gonna go ahead and finish up the eyes with this Chanel Stylo aux Yeux number 88 and the Volume Mascara. So then, in 1922, she's at the Longchamp horse races, and she meets Théophile Bader, who is or was the founder of Les Galeries Lafayette. And he tells her that he wants to sell his perfume in his massive department store. So he introduces her to Pierre Wertheimer. Now, the brothers Pierre and Paul Wertheimer were already in the cosmetics business. They had already created the bourgeois makeup company. The Wertheimer brothers and Coco Chanel got together and they created this corporation called Parfum Chanel. And the brothers agreed to the entire financing of this enterprise. They agreed to pay for everything: the production, the marketing, the distribution, everything. Now, in the contract, it stipulated that they would receive 70% of the profits, that Théophile would get 20, and then Coco would get 10. So almost immediately after she signed this contract, I don't know if she didn't realize what was stipulated and what percentage she would get, but she said that they were bandits who screwed her basically for her money. And I don't know how this happened. I don't know what went on. I wasn't there, neither were you. But I can say that from my research that I've done, up until this point, up until this contract and this business enterprise here, it would seem as though all of the businesses that Coco had done leading up to this were with men that she was romantically attached to. Perhaps leading up to this business deal with the Wertheimer brothers, she hadn't been used to doing her due diligence because she had been used to having contracts and business dealings with romantic partners, and these partners always having her best intentions in mind. I don't know how 70% of the profits not going to her was not noticed beforehand, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, she would say for decades later that they were bandits, that they screwed her over. And also, unfortunately, this is when we first start seeing anti-Semitism in Coco Chanel because the Wertheimer brothers were Jewish. So while we are still in the 1920s, let's talk about some of the things that Coco Chanel helped popularize. Women wearing pants. As I mentioned, when she was in Deauville and other seaside towns, she would observe the sailors and their outfits, and she really liked the look of baggy, oversized sailor pants, and so she helped make that popular for women, because she was a really big fan of mixing masculine and feminine materials and outfits together. She would sometimes use her partner's clothing, like their blazers and their jackets, and mix them into her wardrobe to just like mix masculine and feminine together. She liked blurring that world. With mixing the masculine and feminine outfits, she also made sure to ditch completely the corset. Now, at this point in time, flappers were coming out. We'd had the First World War, we'd had women going into factories, so I don't think that she was necessarily the first fashion designer to throw away the corset, but she definitely helped popularize it. She also helped popularize having a tan, because up until this point, having pale skin was a symbol of how wealthy you were, because only the poor people would be outside working in the field. But on one of her many vacations with her wealthy lovers, I think in the French Riviera, and she got a sunburn. And when she returned to Paris, her skin was a nice, soft, golden tan. And by this point, she was established as a high fashion luxury house. So if Coco had a nice tan, everyone was getting a nice tan. She also helped popularize wearing the color black, because at the time, wearing black was seen as a color of mourning, but she saw black as a really chic, elegant color, and she wanted to make it mainstream. And also the little black dress. Fashion historians don't claim that Coco Chanel invented the little black dress by any means, but she is noted to have made it popular. She submitted a sketch to American Vogue of just a simple, elegant little black dress. And when you look at this, this definitely screams flapper silhouette. So I went ahead and added a lipstick to complete my outfit. I am wearing the Rouge Allure Velvet number 357 Camellia Rouge. So another thing that Coco helped popularize was wearing costume jewelry. So she would mix large fake pearls with gemstones, and this was basically just a way to make jewelry more affordable. Instead of only having royalty wear jewelry, women could go ahead and buy it if they wanted to. And wearing costume jewelry is something that we still do to this day. I mean, we might wear fine jewelry mixed with costume jewelry on a regular basis without even thinking about it. So up until this point, we've talked a lot about the different men in Coco's life, but let's talk about some of the women. So one significant friendship that Coco had was with Missia Sarr. Missia was part of the Parisian bohemian art scene. She is said to have inspired Marcel Proust and also was painted by Renoir. Missia had also been educated at a convent as a child, so her and Coco had that bond together of what life was like at a convent. I can't imagine it was that much fun. And it is said that Missia had this incredible wit and sarcasm about her, which is what drew Coco into this friendship. Another important female friend would be Vera Bate Lombardi. She was part of the British upper elite high society, and up until this point, Coco had made a lot of friends with French high society, but she hadn't yet pierced through onto British high society. And this friendship with Vera would really help her get into that world. At the time, it is said that there was no one more important in high society and fashion in London than Vera. So Coco actually hired her as a public relations representative for her in London, and this would help generate revenue for Coco. Through Vera, Coco went on to meet Hugh Richard Arthur Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster. At the time, he was one of the largest landowners in the world and also one of the wealthiest men in the world. And subsequently, Coco would go on to meet the Prince of Wales, Edward VIII. Coco would have a romantic relationship with the second Duke of Westminster. He would lavish her with jewelry and fine things like she had been used to before, but he would also buy her lots of property and real estate and homes in London, in the French Riviera, etc. It is through the second Duke of Westminster that Coco met Sir Winston Churchill. It needs to be said that the second Duke of Westminster was a notorious anti-Semite. He would go on huge tirades talking about how much he disliked Jewish people and anything you can imagine that an anti-Semite might say. Some historians have said that it is this relationship with the second Duke of Westminster that helped intensify Coco's anti-Semitism. But I have to say that by this point in her life, Coco was in her 40s or 50s. While she may have been influenced by the people in her life, she was also a grown woman. So we are now entering the 1930s. And it has to be noted that during this time in British high society, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. It was, I don't know why, but it was something that was quite popular among the upper elites, including nobility. We mentioned the Prince of Wales, Edward VIII. We know about Edward VIII because he famously abdicated his throne to marry Wallis Simpson. While this may be a romantic story, it is also important to note that they were both anti-Semitic, and they were both supporters of the Nazis and Hitler. Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson actually went to Berlin to meet with Hitler a year after he abdicated his throne, and Edward was photographed doing the Nazi salute with Hitler. I am giving you this information to paint the picture of what British high society and anti-Semitism was like in the 30s and also 40s. When Hitler would talk about Edward VIII, he would say the following: "I am certain through him permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. If he had stayed, everything would have been different. His abdication was a severe loss for us." Okay. On one last note regarding Edward VIII, during the outbreak of the Second World War, he was sent to the Bahamas to be governor in order to stay away from international affairs. So now we are at 1939. There is the outbreak of the Second World War. France has fought briefly, but now has been occupied by Germany. Coco decides to close down her boutique at 31 Rue Cambon. Now, it needs to be said that at the location, 31 Rue Cambon, she had apartments there that she had been staying at. But when the Nazis occupied France, especially Paris, and when they took hold of Paris, she decided to move into the Hotel Ritz. This is noteworthy because the Hotel Ritz was famously known as the preferred residence for upper echelon Nazi officers during the French occupation. It is during her time at this hotel that she met Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage. So we finally found her Baron. The two met and would have a romantic relationship. He was a diplomat and attorney general. He had been part of the German military intelligence since the 1920s. During the Nazi occupation of France, Coco tried to use anti-Jewish laws to get more leverage and basically get more control of Parfum Chanel, because remember earlier when she'd had unsavory business dealings with Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, because they were Jewish, under Nazi law, they were not human and so would be subject to different laws. And she tried to use these laws to her advantage. Unfortunately for her, the Wertheimer brothers knew what was going to happen shortly. So they actually transferred ownership of Parfum Chanel to a business associate who was a French Christian man. Because this man wasn't Jewish, he wouldn't be subject to these anti-Jewish laws. So their business was protected by this business friend. And then after the war, he transferred the company back to the brothers. Ultimately, years later, Chanel and the Wertheimers would renegotiate the contract, and she was estimated to get around 25 million per year or something like that. And under these renegotiations, it was stipulated that the brothers would pay for her living expenses for the rest of her life. So in recent years, there have been declassified French military documents that would suggest very strongly, allegedly, that Coco Chanel was in fact a Nazi spy during the Second World War. Allegedly, her code name was Westminster, and her agent reference number was 7124. These documents allege that Chanel worked with the General Walter Schellenberg. Schellenberg was the chief of German intelligence agency. It has to be noted that after the war, Schellenberg would be tried at the Nuremberg Military Tribunal, and he was found guilty of war crimes. He was sentenced to 6 years, but due to his ailing health, he was released early. Upon his release, Chanel paid for his medical bills, she paid for his family and wife, and she would ultimately pay for his funeral expenses. In 2014, the French intelligence agency declassified documents alleging Coco's collaboration with the Nazis in 2 failed attempts. One of the failed attempts was to have Madrid be taken over by the Nazi Party, and the second alleged involvement was a failed plan to convince Sir Winston Churchill to cease unfriendly relations with the Nazi Party. While there appears to be very strong evidence of her collaborating with the Nazis during the Second World War, allegedly, the Chanel estate and the Chanel fashion house has not confirmed any of these facts. Once the Allies took hold of Paris, Coco fled to Switzerland. In 1944, she was interrogated by a French committee trying to uncover collaborators during the war. This committee did not have any physical documents or proof of her collaborations, so she was set free. Some historians believe that because of Coco's involvement with a lot of upper elites in British society, that if she had been brought to trial, if she had been asked to testify, she could have named a lot of names in British nobility, British aristocracy, and so some historians believe this is what saved her from being outed as a collaborationist after the war. So after the war, she stayed in Switzerland for quite some time, and it should be noted that her relationship with the Baron continued after the war as well. Directly after the war, fashion in Paris changed. There was a new wave of male designers such as Christian Dior and Balenciaga as well, and their fashions were completely opposite to hers. And she had almost a sort of retirement for 15 years. Her fashion house remained closed. She stayed out of fashion, but she did decide to return afterwards, and she decided to reopen her boutique and relaunch her career. By this time, she was already in her 70s. The comeback collection was released in 1954. Now, the French press was very hesitant about this because the French press had heard the rumors of her collaboration. The French press still had a very fresh memory of the war and those who collaborated, but the American and British press saw her new collection after a 15-year hiatus, and they absolutely loved it. She literally had a second career after the Second World War. It's almost as if nothing had happened. She just took a break for a little bit and then just, boom, came back to life. And in the late 50s and early 60s, this is when her Chanel suit and also her handbags had also a revival, because she had already created the Chanel suit earlier on. The previous version of the Chanel suit looked like a flapper aesthetic. When you look at the silhouette, it looks like a flapper dress, except it's in 2 pieces. The version that came out in the 50s and 60s was much more modern. And her handbags as well had been created much earlier in the 20s, but really had a second life afterwards. And when you think of the quintessential 1960s style, personally, I think of Jackie Kennedy dressed in her pink Chanel suit. So I think that this whole aesthetic was very iconic for the decade. Even her perfume, No. 5, had a second life in the 50s and 60s as well. Marilyn Monroe was once famously asked what she wore to bed, and she said, a few drops of No. 5, of course. So this just helped catapult the fashion and the perfume once again. Coco would go on to live until 1971. She passed away at the age of 87 from a heart attack, and she passed away at the Hotel Ritz, where she had been staying for almost 30 years by this point. So let's talk about it. There are clearly some very interesting topics to discuss here. It's clear that Chanel's legacy and history is very complicated. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think that we can judge her for choosing to be a kept woman because at the time women didn't have that many options, but I do think that we can judge her for choosing a Nazi to be one of these men. So something that I've thought of when I was writing the script for this video is, how do we separate the art from the artist? Can we separate the art from the artist? Because we can look at Chanel's life and we can clearly pinpoint decisions that she made, opinions that she had, values that she had that we may not agree with. But since her brand has her name, is it possible to separate who she was as a human being from the brand? Can we separate Coco from Chanel? I personally had to take a few days to digest all of the information that I read because I had heard rumors about her being a collaborator, but I hadn't read all of the details relating to it. So it did take me a few days just to digest all of the information here. So if it takes you some time to digest everything, I understand. So I think this about does it for today's video. This was quite a doozy. I think this video will have ended up being incredibly long, so thank you so much for sticking around for the entire video. If you are new to my channel, I have a series here called Beauty History, where we dive into the history, sometimes complicated history, of different fashion houses and makeup brands. Also, I post regular videos of luxury makeup reviews and tutorials, and whenever I get a new collection, I will create several different looks with the same items. So if this sounds interesting to you, please like, comment, and also subscribe. So I believe this is all I have for you guys for today. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.